Vanished among the gods. Theos Bernard's search for enlightenment in India and Tibet. The sun hovered in the thin mountain air, casting golden rays across the vast Tibetan plateau. In the distance, jagged peaks glistened under a cerulean sky. A lone figure wrapped in a thick chuba, a Tibetan robe, paused along the winding trail. He lifted his head, scanning the horizon as prayer flags flapped in the relentless wind. This man was Theos Bernard, an American scholar-adventurer who had come farther than most Westerners dared to dream. On that day, at the cusp of the 1940s, he was about to enter the fabled city of Lhasa. The trek had been arduous, miles of rugged terrain, exposure to chilling winds, and the constant unpredictability of mountain travel. But for Bernard, each step toward Lhasa was also a stride in an inner pilgrimage. He had begun his journey years before, not just across oceans and mountains, but within himself, from a curious California boy to a world-traveling seeker, scholar of yoga, and eventually author of seminal works on Tibetan Buddhism. His desire was not merely to see the Potala Palace or the Jokhang Temple. He longed to understand and, if possible, experience firsthand the profound practices kept alive in the land of snows. It was said that when he arrived at Lassa's gate, the local guides wondered what drove him. Most foreigners who ventured here came for political intrigue, trade, or, at times, missionary zeal. Bernard came for none of these reasons. He was a yogi in training, a scholar, and something of a dreamer who believed deeply in the possibilities of human transformation. At that moment, as he stood gazing upon the spired rooftops of Lassa's sacred structures, it was not worldly ambition that lit his eyes. Rather, it was a deep reverence for a wisdom tradition he had only read about in cherished Tibetan manuscripts and glimpsed through practice in Indian ashrams. He recalled the promise he had made to himself. If I can reach the heart of Tibetan Buddhism, perhaps I can bring it to those who yearn for the same truths back home. Somewhere in the swirling wind, he thought he heard the faint chanting of monks carrying on the melodies of an ancient lineage. Bernard bowed his head, half in exhaustion and half in prayer, whispering words of gratitude for having made it this far. As the sun dipped lower, shadows stretched across the stony paths, and the American explorer-turned-lama pressed onward. Later, he would recount these days in vivid detail in his book, Penthouse of the Gods, capturing the imagination of Western readers who had seldom seen or heard any genuine insight into the mysterious kingdom on the roof of the world. But that book, and the many adventures leading up to it, would only be a sliver of Theos Bernard's larger story. Here, atop the Tibetan plateau, was a climactic moment in a life shaped by wanderlust, scholarship, and profound spiritual aspiration. Before reaching this point, he had already crossed half the globe, devoured the teachings of yoga in Indian ashrams, and defended an extraordinary thesis at Columbia University on the intricacies of Hatha Yoga. Such were the threads that wove together the tapestry of Bernard's life. Even as he prepared to ascend the final steps to Lassa's heart, he bore the invisible burdens of his Western background, academic rigor, skepticism, cultural ambition, and sought to merge them with the intangible blessings of Eastern wisdom. In the pages that follow, we shall trace that journey from its earliest beginnings, through the labyrinth of Indian and Tibetan sanctuaries, culminating in the works, Penthouse of the Gods, his Columbia thesis, Hatha Yoga, the report of a personal experience, and Heaven Lies Within You, that would help shape Western conceptions of yoga and Tibetan Buddhism for generations to come. Theos Bernard was born on December 10, 1908, in Los Angeles, California. Even at a young age, He exhibited a precocious curiosity and a propensity for adventure. His family was moderately well off, though not wealthy in the sense that would have allowed for idle luxury. But there was an air of unorthodoxy in his household, especially concerning religion and philosophy. Rumors suggest that relatives and close family friends introduced Bernard to unconventional ideas, among them the principles of yoga and Eastern spirituality, long before they became fashionable in American culture. One summer afternoon in 1918, when Bernard was about 10 years old, he discovered a worn copy of an English translation of the Bhagavad Gita on a relative's bookshelf. Intrigued by the swirling stories of gods, righteous battles, and yogic teachings, he spent hours absorbed in the text. Even though he was too young to grasp all its nuances, something about the scripture's emphasis on self-knowledge, duty, dharma, and devotion resonated. He asked his aunt, "Do people in India really live by these words every day?" She smiled, replying, "They do in many different ways. One day you might see it for yourself." Bernard's formal education took place in public schools around Southern California, but his mind seemed always to drift eastward, toward ancient ruins, yogic practitioners, and exotic Himalayan vistas. By his teenage years, he was a voracious reader of anything related to Asia, travelogues of explorers crossing the Gobi Desert, missionaries writing letters from the Sino-Indian border, early anthropological studies on Tibetan tribal customs. Family gatherings often saw him cornering visitors with curious questions. Is reincarnation a real possibility? What is the secret of those who can sit in meditation for hours in the Himalayan caves? These questions often earned him amused looks or puzzled shrugs, but for Theos, they were fuel for a fire that would guide him his entire life. Though his family was not strictly devout in any single faith, their open-mindedness was, in a sense, a catalyst. Without rigid dogma, Bernard felt free to explore whatever system of thought fascinated him. By the time he was preparing to enter college, he had resolved, at least privately, to dedicate himself to understanding the secrets of yoga and the mystical traditions of India and Tibet. During his high school years, he dabbled in athletics, wrestling and swimming primarily, and he found that he excelled at practices involving flexibility and focus. This physical aptitude would later serve him well in his study of Hatha Yoga, especially the advanced asanas and kriyas that tested even the most disciplined practitioners. Yet at that time, no one, including Bernard, could have predicted that he would become one of the first Americans to delve so deeply into these esoteric traditions. Upon graduation from high school, Bernard flirted with the idea of traveling immediately to Asia. But practical realities prevailed. He enrolled at the University of Arizona, focusing initially on more conventional studies, though he remained at heart a seeker. The seeds of his yogic journey had been planted, and as he would later reflect, "My youth was spent searching the horizon for that place where wisdom met the rising sun." In the late 1920s, Bernard began his undergraduate studies at the University of Arizona. Majoring in something as exotic as Indology or religious studies was not straightforward at the time. Such programs were limited. So he chose a more standard path, likely focusing on history or comparative religion, and supplemented it by voraciously reading everything he could find on Eastern spiritual practices. While his classmates crammed for examinations on American history or economics, Bernard found himself poring over the works of Swami Vivekananda, Sir John Woodroffe, a.k.a. Arthur Avalon, translator and commentator on Tantra, and even Helena Blavatsky's theosophical writings. It was during this period that Bernard's intellectual curiosity about yoga merged with an intense desire to practice it. He began experimenting with simple asanas and pranayama techniques gleaned from books, a precarious approach, as genuine guidance was scarce in the West. Late at night, in his cramped dorm room, he attempted the lotus posture, trying to steady his breath and quiet his mind. Sometimes he would describe his experiences to friends. "You should see it," one friend recalled him saying. "The body becomes so calm. The mind feels free." His experiments, while rudimentary, laid the foundation for what would later become his more systematic approach to Hatha Yoga. It was also during these formative years that Bernard encountered occasional mentors, professors who recognized his fervent interest in Eastern thought. One religious studies instructor known to have traveled in India encouraged Bernard to pursue graduate work at a prestigious university like Columbia, which had faculty specializing in Asian languages and cultures. Bernard took the advice to heart. By the time he finished his undergraduate degree, his mind was set on heading to New York City. He once wrote in a letter to a friend, though the exact phrasing is uncertain, "If I want to truly understand the East, I must ground myself in its languages, traditions, and academic rigor. Columbia might be my gateway." He was accepted into a graduate program at Columbia University in the early 1930s, a move that would prove both challenging and life-changing. Once in New York, Bernard found himself in an environment buzzing with intellectual fervor. Prominent scholars of Oriental studies, anthropology, and religion were pushing boundaries and publishing pioneering works. Amid this vibrant community, Bernard stood out. He was not merely another graduate student aiming for a career in academia. He spoke of traveling to India, living among yogis, and carrying out the practices himself. Many professors found his boldness refreshing, though some were skeptical. "You wish to do more than read texts in Sanskrit or Tibetan," one professor remarked. "You want to live them." Bernard nodded. "Yes," he replied simply, his gaze unwavering. When he wasn't attending seminars, reading Sanskrit grammar guides, or writing papers on Indian philosophy, Bernard was seeking out immigrant communities, spiritual societies, and yoga groups in New York. Though still rare, there were circles of Indian expats, theosophists, and early yoga enthusiasts. Occasionally, swamis visiting from India would give lectures on Vedanta or Hatha Yoga, and Bernard would be among the first to arrive, notebook in hand, heart pounding with excitement. As he delved deeper, he realized that academic study, while essential, could never replace direct experience. He became convinced that his destiny was to travel to India. He would fulfill the academic requirements, perhaps complete a thesis, but the real education would happen among sadhus, monks, and Tibetan lamas. That was his dream. Graduating from Columbia with a master's degree laid the groundwork for this dream. In the mid-1930s, he began planning in earnest for a journey east. He studied Hindustani, brushed up on colloquial Tibetan phrases he had gleaned from dictionaries, which he later found both incomplete and inaccurate, and scoured maritime schedules for steamships departing for Bombay or Calcutta. Little did he know that this voyage would set him on a path few Westerners had taken, thrusting him into the heart of Tibetan Buddhism and transforming him into a messenger of Eastern spirituality when he returned to the West. It was 1936 when Theos Bernard stepped off the ship in Bombay's bustling harbor for the first time. The cacophony of languages, the aroma of spices in the air, and the vibrant colors of saris and turbans overwhelmed his senses. He felt a surge of exhilaration and a twinge of trepidation. India was no mere subject to be studied from afar. It was a living tapestry, teeming with millennia of spiritual traditions and cultural complexities. Carrying only a modest trunk of belongings, Bernard found lodging at a budget guest house in the Colaba area. From there, he ventured into the city's labyrinthine streets, visiting temples, conversing with sadhus, and absorbing the layered energy of a land that seemed at once chaotic and serene. He quickly realized that reading about India in the libraries of New York was vastly different from experiencing it firsthand. Bombay was just a starting point. Bernard's initial plan was to visit Pune or perhaps travel southward to Mysore, where he had heard of established yoga schools. Yet, he had also received an invitation to meet Surendranath Dasgupta, a respected Indian scholar of philosophy who resided in Calcutta. Torn between the desire to immerse in yoga practice immediately and the opportunity to study with a distinguished academic, Bernard deliberated. Eventually, he decided to go to Calcutta, reasoning that a teacher like Dasgupta could open doors to more profound experiences later. The train journey eastward across the subcontinent was a revelation. Passing through rural villages, he watched farmers tending their fields, children playing in dusty lanes, and merchants hawking fresh produce at every stop. In his journal, Bernard wrote, "Each glimpse outside my window is a lesson in humility and acceptance. Life here is raw and unvarnished, yet there is a pervasive sanctity in the simplest tasks." Upon arriving in Calcutta, Bernard navigated its crowded streets until he reached the address where Dasgupta lived. The home was modest, yet filled with books on every conceivable aspect of Indian philosophy, from the Vedas to Tantra. As Bernard sat before the scholar, Dasgupta scrutinized the earnest American with a mixture of curiosity and mild skepticism. "So, you have come to learn the intricacies of our traditions?" Dasgupta inquired in polished English. Bernard nodded. "I have studied the texts, but I wish to experience the living teachings." Dasgupta smiled. "That is a commendable goal, but be aware, the path is not for the faint of heart. It requires commitment, discipline, and acceptance that you do not control all outcomes." Over the next few weeks, Bernard attended lectures at the university, visited libraries, and conversed late into the evening with Dasgupta about the nuances of Vedanta, Samkhya, and Buddhist philosophy. He was struck by the scholar's blend of intellectual precision and sincere devotion. Dasgupta encouraged Bernard to consider traveling to places where yoga was actively practiced. He recommended the ashram of Swami Kuvalayananda in Lonavala for a more scientific approach, as well as Rishikesh for a more traditional Himalayan setting. Bernard felt the pull of the mountains, believing that the intangible secrets of Hatha Yoga might be found among the sages dwelling along the Ganges. He thanked Dasgupta for his guidance and prepared for the next phase of his Indian sojourn. Little did he know that these months in India were merely a preliminary run to an even greater quest, his eventual crossing into Tibet, a feat that few Westerners had accomplished. From Calcutta, Bernard made his way to Lonavala near Pune, where Swami Kuvalayananda had founded the Kaivalyadharma Yoga Institute. This was one of the first centers in India dedicated to scientifically studying the effects of yogic practices on the human body. Bernard found the atmosphere exhilarating. Western-style labs sat alongside meditation halls, bridging ancient wisdom with modern empirical methods. Dressed in simple, loose-fitting clothing, Bernard rose before dawn each day. The stillness of the early morning, punctuated by the sound of temple bells and distant chanting, awakened a profound inner focus. At the institute, he underwent a regimen that included asanas, pranayama, and kriyas, various cleansing techniques. He recalled later how disconcerting it was to practice neti, nasal cleansing, and other procedures that were practically unknown in the West. Yet with each passing day, he felt his body becoming more pliable, his breathing more controlled, and his mind sharper. Swami Kuvalayananda himself took an interest in the American student. One evening, while they were seated under a large banyan tree, Bernard asked, "Swamiji, how does one truly master Hatha Yoga? Is it merely a matter of physical discipline?" The Swami reflected for a moment. "Hatha Yoga is often misunderstood. People think it is only about postures, But the real essence is to prepare the body and mind for higher spiritual pursuits. We study it scientifically here, but it remains a sacred practice. Mastery comes when the mind and breath move in unison with awareness. Bernard took these words to heart, recognizing that the technique and theory he was absorbing had to be complemented by deeper spiritual insight. He became especially interested in the bandhas, energy locks, and mudras, energetic gestures, aspects of hatha yoga that are more subtle and internal. These, he believed, were clues to unlocking the true transformative power of yoga, an experience he yearned to document and one day share with Western audiences. After several months in Lonavala, he journeyed northward toward Rishikesh, a gateway to the Himalayas. If Lonavala had been an academic environment, Rishikesh was a spiritual crucible. Sadhus and ascetics dotted the banks of the Ganges, living in austere huts or sometimes simply under trees. Temples resounded with the sounds of conches and devotional singing. Bernard found a small ashram that allowed him to stay in exchange for chores, sweeping, fetching water, helping in the communal kitchen. He spent hours in the morning practicing asanas by the river. In the evenings, he joined other seekers for satsangs, gatherings centered on prayer, chanting, and philosophical discourse. He was particularly taken with the practice of kirtan, the call and response singing of mantras and devotional hymns. The vibrations I feel in my chest when we chant together, there is something profoundly unifying in it, he wrote in his journal. While in Rishikesh, he encountered swamis who possessed remarkable mastery of pranayama, capable of slowing their heartbeat and sitting immobile for hours. He also met mendicants who claimed to have traveled to the hidden valleys of the Himalayas, encountering yogis who had transcended normal human limitations. Bernard's critical Western mind wanted to ask, can this be proven? But his heart was equally aflame with the possibility that these stories might be true. This tension between skepticism and wonder would characterize his entire spiritual quest. Eventually, the time came for Bernard to leave Rishikesh and head to other parts of northern India. Yet the experiences he had there, rising at dawn to the sound of the sacred river, wrestling with the intricacies of pranayama, and falling into a rhythm of prayer and silence, left an indelible mark on his practice. This immersion in yogic discipline laid the groundwork for the thesis he would later write at Columbia University, Hatha Yoga, the report of a personal experience. In that work, he would recount these experiences with an analytical eye and a devotee's fervor, blending academic rigor with personal testimony in a way that was groundbreaking for its time. Upon returning to the United States in the late 1930s, Bernard brought with him not just exotic tales of his sojourn in India, but also a wealth of practical knowledge about yoga. He resumed his studies at Columbia University, determined to complete a doctoral thesis that would bridge the gap between Eastern spiritual practice and Western scholarly standards. He titled it Hatha Yoga, the report of a personal experience, a bold move for an era in which most dissertations on Eastern subjects focused on textual analysis rather than experiential insight. Bernard's thesis committee was wary at first. A dissertation grounded in personal experimentation with yoga postures, breath control, and meditative states was unconventional, to say the least. Yet Bernard presented his case with unwavering conviction. He argued that the heart of yoga could not be fully understood through textual study alone. Traditional Sanskrit texts like the Hatha Yoga Pradipika and the Garanda Samhita often offered cryptic instructions that came to life only when practiced under the guidance of a competent teacher. Having undergone such training firsthand, Bernard believed it was both a scholarly and personal responsibility to record his observations with clinical detail. Despite initial skepticism, Bernard's academic mentors recognized the uniqueness of his approach. They granted him the latitude to proceed. For months, Bernard labored in the library, cross-referencing classical yoga treatises with his own notes from India. He meticulously described each asana, noting the physiological reactions he observed in himself. He also documented the psychological changes he experienced during prolonged pranayama sessions, periods of heightened clarity, or conversely, intense introspection that occasionally revealed unresolved emotions. One chapter addressed the kriyas, or cleansing techniques, many of which Western academics had never witnessed up close. Bernard recounted in sometimes graphic detail the processes of shatkarma, the 6 purification actions, including neti, nasal cleansing, and dhauti, intestinal cleansing. The writing was refreshingly candid but never sensationalist. Rather, it was infused with the earnestness of a researcher who believed in the importance of these practices for holistic well-being. Another chapter delved into the bandhas, locks applied to specific areas of the body to direct pranic energy. Bernard included his subjective experiences of heightened concentration and energy flow, supplemented by references to ancient yogic texts. In describing Mula Bandha, the root lock, for example, he wrote about how sustained practice instilled an unusual sense of groundedness and subtle vitality. These first-hand testimonies were the lifeblood of his dissertation, distinguishing it from purely philological or historical studies of yoga. While preparing for his thesis defense, Bernard faced the challenge of presenting empirical data in a manner acceptable to Western academia. He used rudimentary but innovative methods for his time, measuring his pulse, body temperature, and respiratory rate before and after specific yogic practices. Although these methods might appear crude by today's scientific standards, they added a layer of objectivity that bolstered his credibility in the eyes of the faculty. The day of his defense arrived. Gathered in a small seminar room, his professors listened intently as Bernard described everything from the history of Hatha Yoga to his own experiences under Indian gurus. One member of the committee finally asked, "Mr. Bernard, how do you address the charge that much of what you've reported remains anecdotal and subjective?" Bernard responded calmly, "Hatha Yoga itself claims that experience is crucial. My goal here is to present that experience systematically, in dialogue with the traditional texts. It's not a replacement for scholarship, but a complement to it." The dissertation was approved, marking a milestone in the intersection of yoga and Western academia. In the months that followed, scholars, yogis, and curious laypeople sought out Bernard's insights. Some lauded his work as pioneering, while others questioned the depth of his training. Nevertheless, Hatha Yoga. The report of a personal experience would go on to influence Western perceptions of yoga, underscoring the importance of lived practice in understanding an ancient discipline. Fresh off his success at Columbia, Bernard found himself at the nexus of several worlds. On one hand, he was welcomed into academic circles, intrigued by his first-hand account of yoga. On the other, he was drawn to spiritual gatherings, where seekers, swamis, and mystics converged. The late 1930s in New York City offered a fertile ground for cross-cultural exchange. The lingering effects of the Theosophical movement, the growing popularity of Vedanta societies, and the occasional presence of Indian spiritual teachers all created pockets of Eastern mysticism in the heart of the Western metropolis. Bernard became something of a curiosity, a tall, self-assured Californian who claimed genuine initiation into practices typically reserved for dedicated Indian practitioners. Invitations to speak at small salons and larger lecture halls started to roll in. He shared slides of his travels, grainy photographs of Rishikesh ashrams, Himalayan foothills, and the austere interiors of yoga institutes. His audiences ranged from skeptical professors to wide-eyed bohemians. During a talk at a Manhattan cultural club, someone asked, "Is it true that Indian yogis can levitate?" Bernard responded diplomatically, "I have heard stories, but I have never witnessed it directly. Yoga's real power, I believe, is in transforming our mind and body from within." At the same time, he cultivated friendships with fellow explorers of consciousness. Some were scholars of comparative religion, others were esoteric enthusiasts who saw in Bernard a guide to spiritual wonders they had only read about. He struck a particular rapport with a small group of Western mystics who practiced a blend of Christian mysticism and Eastern meditation techniques. They would gather in someone's loft for evenings of discussion and shared meditation, each session culminating in lively debates about the nature of the soul. During one such gathering, a friend asked Bernard, "Now that you've tasted the essence of yoga in India, do you see yourself staying in academia or returning east?" Bernard paused, sipping a cup of spiced chai he had prepared. "I feel a pull back to Asia," he admitted. "I've yet to discover the deeper aspects of Tibetan Buddhism. I've heard that the monasteries there guard advanced yogic traditions. It's something I can't ignore." This fascination with Tibet was not new to him. While in India, he had heard numerous accounts of lamas who engaged in tummo, the generation of inner heat, advanced tantric practices, and solitary retreats in remote caves. Books like the Tibetan Book of the Dead and Traveller's Tales of Lassa's Forbidden City had captivated his imagination. Now, bolstered by his academic credentials and the success of his Hatha Yoga thesis, Bernard felt a renewed determination to embark on a Tibetan odyssey. Nevertheless, practical concerns weighed on him. Tibet was notoriously closed to foreigners. The British authorities in India maintained strict controls on who could cross the border. Only a handful of Westerners, missionaries, government officials, or explorers like Alexandra David Neal had managed to penetrate Tibetan territory in prior decades, and their passages were often fraught with obstacles. Bernard realized he needed official endorsements and letters of introduction. He also knew that he had to demonstrate respect and sensitivity to Tibetan customs if he hoped to gain any meaningful access to the monasteries. Undeterred, Bernard began corresponding with contacts in India. He drafted proposals for a research expedition, framing it as an academic pursuit to study Tibetan forms of yoga and Buddhist philosophy. In parallel, he secured endorsements from prominent scholars at Columbia and other institutions who were eager to see what new insights Bernard might bring back. And so, by the dawn of 1937, the seeds of his Tibetan journey were planted. Even as he moved through the urbane circles of New York, the call of the Himalayas echoed in his mind, a distant drumbeat urging him onward. By mid-1937, Bernard had made up his mind. He would travel to Tibet. Turning this ambition into reality, however, proved daunting. Besides the logistical challenges, securing financing, acquiring travel documents, and dealing with the British colonial administration in India, there was the matter of local Tibetan permissions. Tibet's government, wary of foreigners, especially after the British expedition led by Colonel Younghusband in 1904, did not grant entry lightly. Bernard arrived in India with letters of recommendation from Columbia professors and other Western academics. In Calcutta, he spent weeks navigating the labyrinthine bureaucracy of British India. Some officials were amused at the idea of an American who wanted to go to Lassa to study Buddhism. Others were downright dismissive. A stern civil servant once told him, "Mr. Bernard, you do realize Tibet is closed to most foreigners? Why not conduct your research in Sikkim or Darjeeling, where Tibetan refugees live?" Unfazed, Bernard persisted. He explained that his mission was academic and spiritual, not political. Eventually, after multiple petitions and interviews, he secured tentative clearance to attempt travel through Sikkim into Tibet, contingent on receiving a proper invitation or acceptance from Tibetan authorities. Even with that hurdle, nothing was guaranteed. He needed local guides, knowledge of the terrain, and the approval of monastic leaders who might host him. In Gangtok, the capital of Sikkim, Bernard encountered another layer of red tape. The Chogyal, king, and local officials were protective of their Himalayan kingdom. At a small administrative office, a Tibetan translator glanced suspiciously at Bernard's papers. "We don't see many Americans here," he remarked through an interpreter. Bernard mustered his best polite smile. "I come in peace, to learn, to share knowledge," he said. Perhaps the sincerity in his voice registered, or perhaps fate was on his side, because not long after, he was granted passage to venture closer to the Tibetan frontier. While waiting in Gangtok, Bernard used the time to acclimatize to high altitudes. He also honed his rudimentary Tibetan language skills, practicing phrases with local monks he met at monasteries. He spent hours in a modest guest house, memorizing essential vocabulary, greetings, common expressions of courtesy, basic Buddhist terms. Sometimes local children would giggle at his accent, but a few kindly corrected his pronunciation, teaching him the guttural and tonal nuances that had no equivalent in English. Yet, the biggest challenge was mental. Tibet loomed before him like a mythical land, full of promise but also potential peril. Stories abounded of harsh mountain passes, bandits, and xenophobic militia. Bernard wrote in his journal, "I must remember that I go as a humble student, not an intruder." He also noted that his yoga training had strengthened him physically and mentally, but he recognized the journey would demand all his reserves of willpower. When the day finally arrived for him to begin the trek, he stood at the edge of a mountainous trail, two sturdy yak loaders beside him. A hired Nepali porter and a Tibetan guide accompanied him, along with a few mules carrying his supplies, warm clothing, dried food, basic medical items, and precious camera equipment. Bernard paused, inhaled the crisp Himalayan air, and offered a silent prayer. This was the threshold. Behind him lay the relative safety of British India. Ahead stretched an expanse of rugged trails, high-altitude wilderness, and the political and cultural enigma that was Tibet. "Let's go," he said softly. The small party set off, a slow procession of figures dwarfed by towering peaks. Above them, the sky was a brilliant cobalt, as if beckoning them forward. Bernard felt both excitement and solemn resolve. He had no illusions about the difficulties that lay ahead, but he sensed that what he might find in Tibet could redefine his understanding of both yoga and Buddhism, and perhaps even reshape his life. The path that led Bernard and his small party from Sikkim into Tibet was narrow, rocky, and at times perilously steep. The altitude was punishing, and the air grew thinner with each passing day. Often, the trail curved around jagged cliffs that dropped into gorges echoing with the roar of mountain rivers. Despite the daunting challenges, Bernard pressed on, fueled by an unyielding sense of purpose. Passing through small Tibetan villages, he was struck by the unwavering kindness of the local inhabitants. Though cautious of foreigners, many recognized his genuine interest in their culture. Children peered from behind adobe walls, laughing when Bernard tried to greet them in Tibetan. "Tashi Delek," he would call, occasionally stumbling over the syllables. In the evenings, his guides negotiated lodging in rustic homes or monasteries. Simple meals of sampa, roasted barley flour, and butter tea became Bernard's staples. The tea, thick and salty, was at first jarring to his palate, but in the chilly mountain climate, it provided much-needed nourishment and warmth. Along the way, he encountered traveling monks, some carrying prayer wheels, others chanting mantras under their breath. Bernard would often stop to exchange a respectful bow or a few words through an interpreter, hoping to glean insights into their spiritual practices. One monk, draped in the maroon robes of the Gelug order, told him, "Tibetans say that all the holy places are a reflection of one's own mind. If your mind is pure, you will see the truth wherever you are." One evening, Bernard's group stopped at a remote monastery perched atop a craggy hill. The abbot permitted them to stay in a small guest chamber. Inside the monastery, Bernard was enthralled by the flickering butter lamps illuminating frescoes depicting Buddhas, bodhisattvas, and wrathful deities. The low hum of monks reciting prayers reverberated through the corridors, creating an atmosphere both eerie and sacred. That night, Bernard wrote in his journal, "These chants seem to stir ancient memories, as though every note carries centuries of devotion." As they moved deeper into Tibet, the journey took on a dreamlike quality. The vast, high-altitude plains stretched to the horizon, dotted with nomadic tents and herds of yaks. Occasionally, they would cross passes that soared above 16,000 feet, where the air was so cold and sparse that each step felt monumental. Bernard's yoga training helped him to maintain calm breathing, an invaluable asset at such elevations. Still, the physical toll was immense. He battled splitting headaches, dizziness, and fatigue. Yet despite the suffering, or perhaps because of it, an inner fortitude blossomed. "This is yoga in action," he murmured to himself, using each step as a meditative practice. News of a visiting American scholar practicing yoga and seeking an audience with Tibetan lamas spread through monastic networks. By the time Bernard's group neared Lassa, rumors had already reached the city. Some monks, curious about this unusual foreigner, were prepared to greet him. Others harbored suspicion, recalling Western incursions of the past. Bernard knew that earning trust would require humility and respect. Finally, the day arrived when he caught his first glimpse of the Potala Palace, standing majestic atop Mapo Ri, Red Hill, overlooking Lhasa. The palace's immense white and red walls seemed to merge seamlessly with the rocky outcrop, like a fortress of the mind itself. Bernard's heart pounded. Here it was, the storied seat of the Dalai Lamas, the legendary hub of Tibetan Buddhism. He bowed his head in reverence, offering a silent vow. "May I learn what I am meant to learn here and share it responsibly with those who seek the same truth." When Theos Bernard finally entered Lhasa, the city matched and exceeded all his imaginings. Narrow alleyways lined with prayer flags fluttering in the wind converged onto bustling squares where merchants hawked spices, textiles, and ritual items. The scent of juniper incense wafted from temple courtyards, mingling with the earthy aroma of yak butter. Everywhere, he heard the murmur of prayers, chanted or whispered, blending into an otherworldly chorus. One of Bernard's earliest stops was the Jokang Temple, the spiritual heart of Lhasa. As he stepped inside, the darkness was broken only by rows of flickering butter lamps. Pilgrims prostrated themselves repeatedly, sometimes covering the entire length of the temple's courtyard with their bodies in a gesture of profound devotion. Bernard watched, transfixed by a level of faith he had seldom witnessed elsewhere. During his first weeks in the city, Bernard lodged at a modest home arranged for him by local intermediaries. A few Tibetan acquaintances, intrigued by his Hatha yoga background, visited, curious about the practices that had led him here. Through an interpreter, they swapped stories. The Tibetans spoke of advanced Tantric yogas like Tummo or inner heat generation and the path of the Bodhisattva. Bernard, in turn, described his experiences in Indian ashrams, capturing their attention with tales of advanced pranayama and purification rituals. He soon gained a reputation as a foreigner who was not merely a political emissary or an adventurer in search of fabled treasures. Rather, he was a Dharma seeker, a man intent on understanding the teachings of the Buddha. This distinction opened doors that might have remained closed to other Westerners. A handful of lamas granted him interviews explaining basic Buddhist concepts in a simplified Tibetan, or sometimes through translators who understood some English or Hindi. All the while, Bernard documented his experiences in meticulous detail. Sketchbooks filled with renderings of temple architecture, local dress, and the swirling lines of Tibetan script. He carried a camera, though photography was not always permissible. Where pictures were forbidden, he took copious notes, describing everything from religious ceremonies to the layout of monastic libraries. These records would later form the backbone of his most famous book, Penthouse of the Gods, a title that evoked both the loftiness of Tibetan spirituality and the literal altitude of the land of snows. Bernard's style in Penthouse of the Gods would blend travelogue, anthropological observation, and spiritual reflection. He dedicated chapters to describing the city's layout, the daily rhythms of monastic life, and his personal encounters with Tibetan yogis. One scene in the book, for instance, recounts his attendance at a massive prayer gathering in the Bakor area, where throngs of devotees circled the Jokang temple. The chanting rose and fell like a tidal wave of devotion, he wrote. I felt both humbled and uplifted, sensing that the city itself was a living mandala, drawing all energies toward its sacred core. Though the book would later captivate Western audiences, Bernard was aware that his perspective was inherently limited. He was a foreigner, an outsider looking in. He tried to adopt a tone of respectful wonder rather than colonial presumption, recognizing the complexities and depth of the tradition he was just beginning to understand. Still, he could not help but be awed by the presence of the Dalai Lama's seat of power, the Potala Palace. Whenever he gazed at it from a distance, whether at dawn or by moonlight, he felt it radiated a silent grandeur as though each stone had been imbued with centuries of prayer. This profound impression shaped the central metaphor of Penthouse of the Gods, that Lassa's spiritual and cultural heights mirrored the inner ascents that yoga and meditation promised. Although Bernard's initial sojourn in Lassa was impressive, his true hunger was for authentic training in Tibetan Buddhist yoga. Obtaining such training proved more challenging. Tibetan monastic education requires years, often decades, of disciplined study, debate, and meditation. Outsiders could rarely hope to receive comprehensive instruction, much less in advanced Tantric practices. However, Bernard's earnest demeanor, coupled with the mystique of his own Hatha yoga background, garnered the interest of certain lamas. Through careful introductions, Bernard connected with a lama rumored to be skilled in tummo, a technique that generates internal heat. Tradition claims that adepts can melt snow around them or dry wet sheets wrapped around their bodies in freezing conditions. Bernard was allowed to visit the lama's modest meditation chamber, high above the main monastery. The chamber contained only a thin mat, a butter lamp, and a few ritual implements, a bell, a vajra, and a small drum. The lama, his eyes half closed, appeared to be in deep meditation. Bernard bowed respectfully and sat on a cushion. Through an interpreter, he asked if the lama could explain how tummo worked. At first, the lama responded with a cryptic smile. Then, after a brief silence, he offered a simple explanation: breath, visualization, and the harnessing of subtle energy channels. It is not a matter of physical heat alone, but an alchemical transformation of body and mind. Eager to learn more, Bernard demonstrated his own pranayama methods, performing slow, deliberate inhalations and exhalations. The Lama watched with interest. The channels of the body are indeed influenced by breath, he said, nodding. Though no formal teacher-student relationship was established, an arrangement that would have required lengthy rituals of initiation, Bernard gleaned crucial insights into the Tibetan perspective on energy work. Soon after, He met another teacher, adept in dream yoga, a practice aimed at achieving lucidity in dreams to recognize the illusory nature of all phenomena. Bernard found parallels to certain states of meditative awareness he had studied in India. He noted, "The practices here blend what I learned in Hatha Yoga, concentration, breath control, and a disciplined mind, with a deep understanding of emptiness and compassion. It's as though they have refined these techniques to an exquisite level of subtlety." One day, Bernard was invited to observe a Tantric ritual in a private temple chamber. Monks in elaborate brocade robes performed intricate mudras as they chanted mantras in hauntingly low tones. Cymbals crashed and long trumpets sounded, reverberating in the enclosed space. At the center of the ceremony stood a sand mandala, painstakingly created over days, if not weeks. Every grain of colored sand formed part of a sacred diagram of the cosmos. Near the end of the ritual, the mandala was destroyed, its sands swept together in a single pile. This profound gesture symbolized impermanence and non-attachment. Bernard was moved to tears at the sight. "If only we in the West recognized so clearly that everything is transient," he later wrote. In his time with these masters, Bernard discovered more than technical practices. He absorbed an ethos, a view that the path of yoga, whether Indian or Tibetan, aimed at dismantling the ego and awakening compassion toward all beings. Indeed, many Tibetan lamas gently reminded him, without bodhicitta, an open heart wishing for the enlightenment of all, these yogas remain mere exercises. Bernard's notes, interviews, and observations formed the core of his later writings on Tibetan Buddhism. Though he was not granted the full transmissions of advanced Tantra or the extended mentorship one might receive after a decade in the monastic system, the glimpses he did receive were invaluable. He was, for a time, a bridge between worlds, learning enough to sense the profound depth and then returning with stories and insights that would spark Western interest in the hidden practices of the Himalayas. The longer Bernard stayed in Tibet, the more he realized that lofty ideals alone would not sustain him. A host of practical difficulties demanded his attention. Provisions were scarce in Lassa, local diets relied heavily on yak butter, roasted barley, and meat soups. Though sustaining, these foods took a toll on Bernard's digestive system, accustomed to a more varied menu. At higher altitudes, he found his body craving fresh produce he could not easily obtain. He experimented with yoga techniques to bolster his digestion and overall vitality, but it was a persistent battle. Language also posed a challenge. While he had learned some Tibetan, his proficiency was limited, and many concepts central to Buddhism and Tantric yoga had no direct English equivalents. He relied heavily on interpreters who themselves might lack deeper knowledge of advanced practices. This layer of mediation often meant that subtleties in instruction or philosophical discourse were lost. Moreover, political tensions simmered beneath the surface. Although Bernard had received official permission to be in Lhasa, he was conscious of the uneasy relationship between Tibet and the British authorities in India. Local officials still harbored suspicions about foreign intentions, especially given past intrusions. He strove to maintain a low profile, focusing on his studies and spiritual interests rather than involving himself in local politics. Nevertheless, he was constantly reminded that his presence was a privilege that could be revoked at any time. Amid these outer difficulties, Bernard's inner journey was also fraught with challenges. Initially, he was elated by the sense of mystery and discovery. Over time, however, the rigors of life at high altitude, the cultural barriers, and the weight of his scholarly ambitions began to take a psychological toll. In private journal entries, he acknowledged periods of doubt. Was he truly learning the essence of Tibetan yoga or merely skimming its surface? Did his Western roots hinder him from accessing teachings reserved for those who had spent a lifetime in monastic study? One night he confided in a Tibetan acquaintance, a lay practitioner who lived near the Potala. "I feel there is so much I don't understand, so much I can't quite grasp," Bernard said with uncharacteristic vulnerability. The man, older and wise in the ways of both Tibetan tradition and human nature, replied softly, "Our teachings say that the path is like a winding mountain road. Sometimes you see only one switchback at a time. Keep walking." This simple reassurance renewed Bernard's resolve. He re-immersed himself in daily practices, rising early for breath exercises, devoting time to meditation, and attending pujas whenever allowed. In these ceremonies, he found a sense of communal spiritual energy that reinvigorated his dedication. Even if he could not fully participate, merely observing the focus and devotion of the monks offered a reminder of why he had undertaken this journey in the first place. He also delved deeper into textual study, poring over Tibetan translations of Mahayana sutras and commentaries on Vajrayana practices. Whenever he encountered parallels with Hatha yoga techniques, such as breath retention or subtle body visualizations, he made careful notes. He sensed that what united these different traditions was more significant than their differences. Both recognized the human potential to transcend ordinary limitations through disciplined practice, ethical living, and a vision of the sacred. Through these trials, Theos Bernard's Tibetan sojourn matured from a bold adventure to a profound, if often humbling, pilgrimage. Each stumbling block, be it physical discomfort, cultural barriers, or existential doubts, became an occasion for reflection, testing the mettle of his conviction. In the process, he learned that yoga, in the broadest sense, is not confined to a mat or a monastery. It is an approach to life, an ongoing dialogue between inner aspiration and outer reality. In late 1938, with winter approaching and the already harsh conditions in Lassa threatening to become unforgiving, Bernard decided to begin his journey back to India. Part of him longed to stay in Tibet indefinitely to uncover every layer of its spiritual treasures. But practicalities beckoned. His visa allowances were finite, and the promise of sharing his experiences with a Western audience had grown into a sense of responsibility. The journey out of Tibet retraced much of the treacherous path he had taken in, yet somehow it felt different. The terrain was the same, the high mountain passes, the narrow trails, the sweeping vistas of the plateau, but Bernard himself had changed. More confident, perhaps, and tempered by the realities of Himalayan life. When he finally reached the Indian border, he breathed a sigh of relief mixed with lingering wonder at all he had witnessed. After a brief period of rest in Darjeeling and then Calcutta, Bernard made his way back to the United States. The academic and spiritual circles he had left behind were eager for accounts of his Tibetan exploits. Invitations to speak at universities, cultural societies, and even social clubs poured in. Bernard delivered a series of lectures replete with slides of Lassa's temples, descriptions of Tantric ceremonies, and stories of yogic feats. In each talk, he emphasized the depth of Tibetan Buddhism, cautioning his audiences against sensationalism. "It is not a land of magic tricks," he would say, "but a place where ancient wisdom is woven into daily life." During this period, Bernard began working on two major writing projects. The first was Penthouse of the Gods, a narrative that combined travelogue, spiritual reflection, and ethnographic detail. Though the writing process was intense, Bernard found it cathartic. Reliving his experiences through prose allowed him to clarify what he had learned, distilling the essence of Tibetan yoga and monastic life into vivid accounts that he hoped would spark reverence rather than mere curiosity. The second project was more intimate. Tentatively titled Heaven Lies Within You, It was a reflection on the common threads of yoga, both Hatha and Tibetan, that emphasized the idea that enlightenment or spiritual realization is not confined to remote mountains or cloistered monasteries. Rather, Bernard argued, the same inner potential exists in every human being, regardless of cultural background. Heaven, as he put it, is not so much a place as a state of being, a realization of our interconnectedness and the inherent divinity that can be awakened through sincere practice. While he wrote, Bernard continued to teach and lecture. He often demonstrated basic hatha yoga postures, astonishing onlookers with his flexibility and poise. "This is the lotus posture," he would announce, folding his legs into a perfect padmasana. The real test, however, is not what you can do with your body, but how you can transform your mind. He held smaller workshops for those who wished to delve deeper, guiding them through pranayama and meditation techniques adapted from his Himalayan training. His repute grew, but so did the demands on his time. Friends cautioned him not to become a spectacle. "Your message is profound," one confidant advised. "Don't let it be overshadowed by the novelty of your experiences." Bernard took the warning seriously, attempting to strike a balance between public engagement and personal study. By the early 1940s, with both Penthouse of the Gods and Portions of Heaven, Lies Within You nearing completion, Bernard felt a renewed sense of purpose. He saw himself as a conduit, a channel through which the wisdom of the East could flow into Western minds, bridging cultural divides. Yet he was also acutely aware of how easily spiritual teachings could be commercialized or trivialized. The responsibility weighed on him, but he embraced it. "If I can bring even a drop of Tibetan compassion and yogic discipline to the West," he told a reporter once, "then perhaps my journey was worth it." Released in the early 1940s, Heaven Lies Within You was a quieter, more introspective work compared to Bernard's more famous travel narrative, Penthouse of the Gods. Where the latter offered vivid descriptions of Tibetan landscapes, monastic rituals, and the socio-political undercurrents of Lhasa, Heaven Lies Within You turned inward, exploring the universal principles of yoga and spirituality that he believed transcended cultural boundaries. The central thesis of the book was elegantly simple, that each individual possesses an inherent capacity for spiritual realization, a metaphorical heaven that can be accessed through disciplined practice, ethical living, and heartfelt devotion. Bernard drew upon his experiences in both Indian Hatha Yoga and Tibetan Vajrayana teachings to illustrate his points. He wrote chapters on the cultivation of compassion, the significance of breath control, and the importance of contemplative stillness in daily life. Unlike some of his earlier academic writings, this was a more accessible text, intended for a broader readership. In one passage, Bernard recounted a particularly transformative meditation session near the banks of the Ganges in Rishikesh. He described how the roar of the river seemed to merge with the pulsing of his own bloodstream, creating a sense of unity between himself and the surrounding world. "At that moment," he wrote, "I felt as if the boundary between me and everything else dissolved, and in that dissolution I sensed an infinite wellspring of peace. Perhaps that is the heaven we all carry within us." He also included personal anecdotes about the challenges of maintaining a spiritual outlook while juggling modern Western responsibilities. Letters from readers poured in, many thanking Bernard for addressing the question of how to integrate yoga into a busy life of work and family. One typical letter said, "I cannot go to India or Tibet, but your words make me think that maybe I do not have to. Perhaps the journey is also within." Bernard responded to these letters earnestly, affirming that while pilgrimage and guidance from qualified teachers could be invaluable, the real transformation always occurred in one's inner sanctuary. The book was not without its critics. Some Western scholars questioned the practicality of combining Hatha Yoga with Tibetan Buddhist concepts, suggesting that Bernard might be blending traditions that were distinct. He replied in interviews and footnotes that he was not attempting to create a new system, only highlighting the complementary aspects that he felt pointed toward a common experiential truth. All these paths, he wrote in a later edition, are but different rivers flowing into the same ocean. Over time, Heaven Lies Within You found a diverse readership, from the spiritually curious to serious practitioners of yoga and Buddhism. It planted seeds in the collective Western mind, foreshadowing the latest surge of interest in meditation, Eastern philosophy, and holistic well-being that would sweep the United States in the 1960s and beyond. The publication of Heaven Lies Within You also solidified Bernard's standing as a visionary of sorts. While he was not the only Westerner exploring these avenues, others like Walter Evans Wentz had translated Tibetan texts, and Paul Brunton had written about yogis. Bernard's dual role as both a scholar and a practitioner lent his message a unique credibility. People sensed his sincerity, and his first-hand experiences in the Himalayas made for compelling storytelling. Even as his visibility grew, Bernard remained restless. The success of his books and lectures had made him something of an early celebrity in spiritual circles, but he yearned for a more secluded existence where he could deepen his own practice. He would later confess to a friend, "I fear the glare of publicity might overshadow the real work of yoga, the work that happens quietly within one's own heart." Behind the public persona, author, lecturer, world traveler, Bernard continued to refine his personal spiritual practice. Over the years, he had accumulated an eclectic toolkit: hatha yoga postures, pranayama techniques, and Tibetan meditation methods that emphasized visualization and mantra. If Heaven Lies Within You offered a broad philosophical scaffold, Bernard's own practice was the laboratory where he tested these ideas in real time. On a typical day, he would rise before sunrise, seating himself on a mat in a dimly lit corner of his apartment. Although he lived in a bustling American city, he tried to recreate the monastic atmosphere of an ashram or a Tibetan retreat hut. Incense burned gently as he closed his eyes. He began with slow, measured breathing, recalling the teachings he had learned at Kaivalyadama in Lonavala. He moved on to asanas, holding each posture with steady concentration. Then came more subtle practices. Drawing upon what he had learned from Tibetan lamas, he would focus his mind on a chosen deity or symbol, chanting mantras under his breath and visualizing channels of light coursing through his body. He also experimented with Tummo-inspired techniques, though he lacked the frigid Himalayan environment that made the practice so dramatically illustrative in Tibet. Still, on chilly winter mornings, he would attempt to generate warmth through controlled breathing and mental imagery. Whether or not he achieved the feats reputed to Tibetan adepts, he did notice an increased resilience to cold and an overall sense of heightened energy. Friends and associates who visited Bernard sometimes found him mid-practice, his apartment redolent with incense and filled with the low hum of chanting. "Are you turning yourself into a monk?" one jested. Bernard smiled, but only partly in jest, when he replied, "Why not? Monastic life is, in a sense, a state of mind." He believed that even city dwellers could create their own sacred spaces, bridging the gap between the outer world and the inner sanctum. This fusion of Indian and Tibetan methods was not strictly orthodox. Many traditional teachers emphasized the importance of lineage-specific teachings and cautioned against mixing practices haphazardly. Bernard was aware of such concerns and endeavored to remain faithful to the core principles underlying each tradition. He saw no fundamental contradiction in combining them, as long as the practitioner maintained a sense of reverence and integrity. "Yoga," he often stated, "is unity within ourselves among teachings, and ultimately with all creation. In his lectures, Bernard began to share select aspects of these integrated practices. He guided small groups of serious seekers through pranayama sessions, introducing them to basic visualization techniques. Skeptics questioned whether he was diluting distinct traditions or overstepping cultural boundaries. Bernard responded that he was merely drawing from two streams that had nourished him, seeking to illustrate their common ground. "My path," he explained, "is a personal one, but perhaps it can serve as a model for those who wish to explore the convergence of Hatha Yoga and Tibetan meditation." Among those who attended Bernard's sessions was a woman named Maria, a pianist struggling with stage fright. She later recounted how the breathwork and visualization drills helped her quell performance anxiety. Another was a retired schoolteacher named John, who found renewed energy in daily yoga postures, eventually crediting Bernard for easing his chronic back pain. These personal stories buoyed Bernard's conviction that yoga, in its broadest sense, could be a universal balm, addressing everything from physical ailments to existential angst. Nonetheless, Bernard never claimed to be a guru. He saw himself as a conduit, an enthusiastic communicator of what he had witnessed and practiced. "If you want the deeper transmissions," he would say, "seek out authentic teachers. India and Tibet have many. But start where you are, with what you have, and let your sincerity guide you." Despite the outward success, books published, lectures well attended, a growing circle of admirers, Theos Bernard grappled with personal challenges that weighed heavily on his spirit. For one, the demands of public life left him little room for the sustained contemplative solitude he craved. He was often on the move, either promoting his writings or advising people curious about yoga. "I sometimes feel like a spiritual entertainer," he confided to a colleague. "They come to see the man who's been to the penthouse of the gods. But what I'd like most is to remain in that penthouse, quietly, searching for deeper truths." Additionally, Bernard's relationships were complicated. He had been married briefly, and though details were sparse, close associates reported that his dedication to spiritual pursuit created strains in his personal life. One friend recalled him admitting, "How can I share a life with someone who does not share this yearning? Yoga is not just what I do, it's who I am." There was a poignancy in his voice that hinted at the emotional toll of such a singularly focused life. Health issues also emerged. Years of traveling, living in extreme climates, and pushing his body through rigorous yoga experiments had left him susceptible to various ailments. At times, old injuries from practicing advanced asanas in less than ideal conditions flared up, reminding him of his physical fragility. Publicly, he maintained a stoic disposition, attributing his relatively good health to the virtues of yoga. Privately, however, he admitted to occasional bouts of exhaustion and anxiety, yet these difficulties also served as a crucible for spiritual growth. Bernard poured himself into his meditations with renewed fervor, using each setback as a lesson in humility. "Suffering," he wrote in his journal, "is the master teacher that none of us wants, but all of us need. It peels back the layers of ego and reveals what truly sustains us." When insomnia struck, a condition not uncommon to those balancing high public demands with deep internal work, he viewed the restless nights as opportunities for extended breathwork and introspection. In these private moments, Bernard evolved from a mere traveler-explorer into something akin to a modern mystic. He delved more deeply into the philosophical underpinnings of both Indian and Tibetan thought, reading translations of the Upanishads alongside the Tibetan Book of the Dead. The concept of impermanence resonated deeply. Everything, including his own successes and struggles, was a passing phenomenon. He wrote that the lesson he took from Tibetan Buddhism was that one must hold both triumph and tragedy lightly, letting them flow like clouds across the sky of awareness. Friends who visited him during this period often found him unusually serene, even when external pressures mounted. "He has changed," one acquaintance observed. "There's a calm about him that wasn't there before, even when he was fresh back from Tibet. It's as if he's found a way to be in the world, but not entirely of it." Bernard's deepening practice also brought him closer to certain religious orders and spiritual communities in the West. He began assisting with the formation of small meditation groups in both New York and California, offering guidance rooted in Eastern traditions. His teachings were direct but gentle, focusing on posture, breath, and the cultivation of equanimity. Some who attended these gatherings claimed that simply being in Bernard's presence inspired a sense of peace, as though his own inner work emanated outward. In the midst of these personal trials and transformations, Bernard continued to emphasize that no single teacher, path, or book could grant enlightenment. Each seeker must walk the path themselves, he insisted. And walk it he did, weaving the threads of Hatha Yoga, Tibetan Buddhist practice, and his own evolving insights into a tapestry that illuminated the potential of spiritual synthesis. His very life, with its highs and lows, triumphs and tribulations, became a testament to the transformative power of dedicated practice. As the 1940s progressed, Theos Bernard's name began to take on a near-mythic quality in certain circles. Tales of the tall, lean American who had ventured into Lassa and trained in both Indian and Tibetan yogic disciplines circulated widely, sometimes embellished with hearsay. Students of esotericism repeated stories of Bernard meditating in Himalayan caves for weeks on end, though the actual durations of his retreats were typically shorter. Others whispered that he had received initiations into secret tantric lineages, though Bernard himself rarely claimed any formal empowerment. This growing legend presented Bernard with a peculiar predicament. He neither wished to become a guru nor to feed the sensationalism that often accompanied stories of the mystical East. Yet the Western appetite for exotic tales persisted, fueled by limited direct access to places like Tibet. Publishers eager for the next spiritual bestseller, journalists fishing for stories on Himalayan secrets, and socialites wanting to host the intriguing Lama Bernard all clamored for his attention. He navigated this terrain cautiously. In interviews, Bernard attempted to ground the conversation in reality. When asked if he possessed supernatural powers, he would reply calmly, "The greatest power is mastery of oneself. Everything else is window dressing." If pressed about alleged esoteric rites he had undergone, he would politely demur, pointing out the necessity of discretion and respect for the traditions involved. "I'm just a student," he would say. "The mysteries of Tibetan Buddhism are guarded for good reason. They require a maturity and ethical framework not easily found in casual seekers." Yet despite his attempts to remain modest, rumors abounded. Some claimed he was an incarnate bodhisattva, others scoffed, labeling him an opportunist. The polarized views around Bernard only magnified his mystique. Within academic circles, he was both praised for his pioneering fieldwork and critiqued for possible romanticization of Tibetan culture. A leading anthropologist once stated, "Bernard's contributions are valuable, yet his interpretations occasionally stray into the realm of the idealized. More rigorous peer review is needed to separate fact from personal impression." Bernard responded to such critiques with grace, acknowledging the limitations of any outsider studying a highly complex religious system. "I can only offer what I experienced and what I strove to understand," he wrote in a published rebuttal. "Others will come, perhaps more prepared and with deeper linguistic skills to expand upon or correct what I have presented." Amid the swirling narratives, a deeper enigma began to take shape. How had Bernard managed to access so many Tibetan teachings in such a relatively short span? Some Western Tibetologists found it inconceivable that a foreigner could assimilate more than a superficial level of Vajrayana practice without extended tutelage. Others countered that the events in Tibet during the 1930s and 1940s were in flux, possibly allowing for exceptions to the usual protocols. Bernard himself remained cagey about the specifics, likely bound by a combination of personal humility, respect for his teachers, and the vow of secrecy integral to higher tantras. His personal life, too, remained somewhat opaque. Acquaintances described him as warm yet private, devoted to his practice and writing. He was known to vanish for days, retreating to a secluded cabin in the countryside to immerse himself in meditation and study. Occasional visitors to that cabin painted a picture of a minimalist setting, just a bedroll, a small altar with Tibetan and Indian icons, and piles of books on Buddhist philosophy and Sanskrit commentaries. All this contributed to the aura of myth. Even after the publication of Penthouse of the Gods and Heaven Lies Within You, the question lingered. Who was Theos Bernard, really? A fearless adventurer? A dedicated scholar practitioner? A modern spiritual pioneer bridging East and West? Or a romantic spirit longing for an unattainable ideal? The truth, as always, lay in a complex blend of these narratives. To Bernard himself, the real question was not about his identity, but about the sincerity of one's search. Titles, myths, reputations, they come and go, he would often remark. What remains is the practice, the inward journey that each of us must undertake. By the mid-1940s, Bernard's restlessness surfaced once more. He had achieved recognition in the West, penned influential books, and inspired many seekers to explore yoga and Buddhism. Yet he felt unfinished business calling him back to the Himalayan regions. He missed the stark simplicity of monastic courtyards and the resonant chants echoing off stone walls. He ached for the unfiltered presence of spiritual elders whose life stories spanned decades of silent retreat. Plans for a return trip to Tibet were complicated by global upheavals. World War II had impacted international travel, and political tensions in Asia were accelerating. Still, Bernard pressed forward, forging connections with Indian acquaintances who might facilitate his journey. Some warned him that Tibet was becoming increasingly suspicious of foreign visitors, and the British authorities were more cautious than ever about granting passage. Undeterred, Bernard believed his previous ties could open doors. "I've been there before. They know me," he reassured friends. In late 1947, he left the United States for India, intending to make his way north once again. Details of his route and intentions were not widely publicized. He seemed to prefer an understated approach, perhaps to avoid the very bureaucratic entanglements that could halt his progress. Close confidants say he talked of venturing beyond Lassa, this time deeper into remote areas rumored to house hermit yogis. "The real heart of Tibetan yoga," he told one correspondent, "lies beyond the main cities, in the isolated valleys and caves where the practices are passed down quietly." There are conflicting accounts of what happened next. Some say he arrived in India and attempted to cross into Tibet through a lesser-known pass, possibly via the Spiti region in Himachal Pradesh or a rugged route from Ladakh. Others claim he met with misfortune somewhere along the Indian-Tibetan border, perhaps running afoul of bandits or local militia who mistook him for a spy. There's even a story that he ventured into a stretch of mountainous terrain during unseasonably harsh weather and never emerged. What is generally agreed upon is that Bernard disappeared without a clear trace. Rumors swirled. Some believed he was killed by bandits, others suggested he died of exposure, and a few speculated he might have chosen to remain in Tibet clandestinely, shedding his Western identity to live out his days as a yogi. None of these hypotheses were confirmed. Official records from the British Indian administration were inconclusive, providing only cryptic notes about a missing American traveler. The uncertainty surrounding Bernard's fate only amplified his legend. In the following years, people claimed to have seen him in the back alleys of Kathmandu, or crossing a high pass near Mount Kailash, or visiting a hidden monastery in the far reaches of eastern Tibet. None of these sightings were verified, and they merely fueled the notion that Bernard had transcended a mundane existence, merging with the Himalayan wilderness he so loved. Friends in America mourned the loss of a pioneer. Academic colleagues memorialized him in journals, praising his groundbreaking work on yoga and Tibetan Buddhism. Devotees lit candles and performed prayers for his safe passage wherever he might be. His family attempted to seek official confirmation of his whereabouts, but in that turbulent post-war era, communication lines were frayed and no definitive answers surfaced. The abrupt end, or unending mystery, of Bernard's story underscored his life's overarching theme. He had always sought the unexplored frontier, both externally in the Himalayas and internally within the vast realm of spiritual practice. To vanish in those jagged mountains without resolution seemed in a strange way fitting, as though he had stepped into the mythic domain that he himself had depicted in his writings. Decades later, scholars would revisit Bernard's contributions, sometimes noting the possible inaccuracies or embellishments in his accounts. Yet almost everyone agreed that he had opened a door, however slightly, for Western readers to glimpse the profound heritage of Tibetan yoga and Buddhism. The final chapter of his life, shrouded in mystery, elevated him from mere traveler to an almost archetypal figure, a pilgrim who set forth in search of ultimate wisdom and never returned to say what he found. In the end, the ambiguous nature of Bernard's disappearance also reflected the ephemeral truth at the core of Buddhist teachings. All things are impermanent. One day, a man stands before you, lecturing on the intricacies of yoga or the hidden wisdom of the Himalayas. The next, he is gone, leaving behind only footprints in the snow, half-finished manuscripts, and the resonance of a dream that continues to intrigue generations of spiritual seekers. For many in the West, Theos Bernard's works, especially Penthouse of the Gods and the insights presented in his thesis on Hatha Yoga, served as a first glimpse into a realm previously perceived as sealed off by high mountains and secrecy. Though Western interest in yoga and Buddhism had its roots in earlier figures like Swami Vivekananda and Sir Edwin Arnold, Bernard brought a unique blend of personal narrative and scholarly aspiration that captured imaginations. In the decades that followed his disappearance, yoga studios began sprouting in Western cities, often referencing texts and methods that Bernard had described. While he was not solely responsible for the burgeoning popularity of yoga, various Indian teachers and the rise of global counterculture in the 1960s played pivotal roles. His publications were frequently cited. Passages from Hatha Yoga, the report of a personal experience, found their way into academic curricula, illustrating the concept that yoga could be approached as both a scientific and a spiritual discipline. Meanwhile, Penthouse of the Gods inspired numerous would-be explorers to consider Tibet not just a land of political intrigue or anthropological curiosity, but a repository of esoteric wisdom. Some travelers managed to slip into Tibetan territories in the 1950s prior to China's tighter control. Others studied in Himalayan regions of Nepal or northern India, encountering Tibetan refugees who fled the political upheavals of the mid-20th century. In these encounters, Bernard's name occasionally surfaced. Older lamas recalled meeting the American who practiced yoga, while younger monks recognized the covers of his books, having seen them among the few Western publications about Tibet available in diaspora libraries. Academia, too, took note, Anthropologists, Indologists, and scholars of religion wrote papers dissecting Bernard's accounts, separating his personal reflections from verifiable data about Tibetan monasteries and yogic practices. Some criticized perceived romanticization or incomplete understanding in his works, while others applauded his courage and pioneering spirit. If nothing else, Bernard's writings beckoned further investigation, encouraging scholars to fill in the gaps he'd left. His emphasis on the experiential dimension of yoga resonated well into the modern mindfulness movement. The idea that real knowledge of yoga or Buddhism transcends intellectual debate and requires personal immersion found traction among those disillusioned by purely materialistic or dogmatic approaches to life. Teachers of both Hatha and Tibetan traditions sometimes read excerpts from Bernard's books to illustrate the synergy between posture, breath, and a wider vision of spiritual reality. Yet for all his influence, Bernard remained somewhat of an enigma. Discussions around him often circled back to his mysterious disappearance and the myths that arose in its wake. Maybe he found what he was looking for and chose never to return, mused one popular yoga teacher in the 1970s. We all have that yearning in us, don't we, to just keep going until we reach the seat of the gods. In more recent times, as global interest in Tibet spiked alongside political awareness of the region, Bernard's travel narrative has been examined for cultural biases or oversights. But even critical voices acknowledge the sincerity underlying his search. His legacy endures as a reminder that the bridging of East and West often involves risk, humility, and the willingness to be changed by what one encounters. Perhaps most intriguingly, Bernard remains relevant to modern practitioners who see his life as a testament to the spiritual path's capacity for continuous evolution. One can begin in the dusty halls of an American university, ascend the Himalayan heights of spiritual aspiration, and ultimately vanish into the silence of those same peaks, leaving behind only echoes. Those echoes, it turns out, continue to spark inquiry, wonder, and devotion even generations later. If there is a single thread that weaves through Theos Bernard's life, it is the notion of searching. From his early childhood curiosity about the Bhagavad Gita to his final mysterious quest in the Himalayan borderlands, Bernard was animated by a relentless desire to know, not merely in the intellectual sense, but through direct experience. This drive shaped his educational pursuits at the University of Arizona and Columbia, his travels throughout India, and ultimately his daring forays into Tibet. His approach to learning was holistic. When confronted with a text, he did not simply read it, he sought to embody it. Whether it was mastering difficult Hatha yoga asanas or probing the intricacies of Tibetan Tantric rituals, Bernard's guiding principle was that truth must be lived, not merely studied. This principle infused both his published works and his personal relationships. Those who met him often remarked on his intensity, as if he were constantly probing the deeper layers of every conversation and every practice. Yet for all his earnestness, Bernard grappled with the realities of bridging vastly different cultures. He stood at a liminal point between the rigor of Western academia and the mystical traditions of the East. Each side, in its own way, demanded certain concessions. Academia wanted him to be critical and detached. The yogic traditions required devotion and surrender. Bernard's life can be read as a continual negotiation of these two expectations. At his best, he demonstrated how scholarship and devotion could enrich each other. At his most troubled, he suffered from the pressures of never quite belonging wholly to one world or the other. Another key theme is transformation, both personal and collective. On a personal level, Bernard's encounters with yoga and Buddhism reshaped his body, mind, and spirit. The disciplined routines of breathwork and meditation strengthened him physically and psychologically. The philosophical teachings on impermanence and compassion softened the edges of his Western individualism, inviting a more expansive view of the human condition. Collectively, by writing about these practices, Bernard helped pave the way for future generations in the West to explore Indian and Tibetan spiritualities without quite as much suspicion or misunderstanding. But perhaps the most poignant aspect of Bernard's life is its open-ended nature. His disappearance leaves questions that can never be definitively answered. Did he perish in a remote Himalayan valley, succumbing to the very forces of nature he so revered? Or did he slip quietly into Tibetan territory, merging with the monastic life he had long idealized? Speculations abound, but each possibility is tinged with a kind of poetic closure. If he died on the journey, it was while pursuing the highest peaks, literal and metaphorical. If he stayed, he found the deeper immersion he had always sought. In either scenario, Bernard's story becomes a modern parable about the risks and rewards of spiritual seeking. It asks us to consider how far we're willing to go for the sake of truth and whether we might lose ourselves or perhaps find ourselves along the way. His life echoes the archetype of the wanderer, the pilgrim who leaves behind the known, and the comfortable in pursuit of something that can't be fully named or contained. Today, as yoga and meditation have become mainstream phenomena in much of the world, Bernard's pioneering steps remind us of the earnest dedication that underpinned these practices when they were less universally understood. He stands, in retrospect, as both a visionary and a cautionary figure, someone who dared to venture beyond familiar horizons, but also someone who bore the weight of that choice, personally and profoundly. That he remains, in the final analysis, something of a mystery may be entirely fitting. As he himself wrote, "The final truths of yoga and Tibetan Buddhism cannot be pinned down like butterflies in a case. They are living, breathing realities that call us to a deeper life. And in that call, perhaps, lies the only certainty we ever need." Decades after Theos Bernard's disappearance, his books and writings continue to circulate among those interested in spiritual studies, yoga, and Tibetan Buddhism. Penthouse of the Gods still captivates readers with its travelogue style and vivid depiction of Lassa, reminiscent of an era before rapid globalization. Heaven Lies Within You remains a thoughtful text for those seeking an integration of Eastern contemplative practices with Western life. Bernard's doctoral thesis, Hatha Yoga. The report of a personal experience, though more academic, has also secured a place in the history of yoga studies. In the modern yoga community, many instructors and practitioners consider it a pioneering document of experiential scholarship. While subsequent research has offered more precise scientific frameworks, Bernard's thesis still stands out for its unapologetically personal approach. As the interest in holistic wellness burgeons, yoga's therapeutic and spiritual dimensions are increasingly recognized in the West. Bernard's emphasis on the profound interplay between breath, posture, and mental state resonates with practitioners who seek more than a fitness routine. Even those who are unaware of Bernard's name indirectly benefit from the cultural and intellectual groundwork he helped lay. The concept that yoga might be studied empirically without forfeiting its spiritual integrity was groundbreaking in Bernard's time and remains influential. Furthermore, with Tibet's continued prominence in global consciousness, both spiritually and politically, Bernard's accounts of his interactions with Tibetan lamas and yogic adepts hold renewed relevance. While modern scholarship may correct or refine some of his observations, his first-hand narratives give a glimpse into a world that has undergone seismic changes, especially after the mid-20th century. In a sense, his words preserve snapshots of Tibetan religious life before the upheavals that forced thousands of monks, nuns, and lay people to seek refuge across the Himalayas. Even outside spiritual circles, Bernard's story captivates those intrigued by adventure and exploration. His journeys exemplify a quest that merges geographical daring with inner transformation. Travel writers sometimes reference Bernard as a seminal figure who combined the fervor of an explorer with the introspection of a meditator. In an era when adventure travel often focuses on adrenaline sports, Bernard's approach reminds readers that travel can also be a pilgrimage, an inward as much as an outward journey. In more academic arenas, Bernard's works are subjects of continued debate. Scholars of religion scrutinize his methodology, noting that while he lacked the linguistic prowess of later Tibetologists, his genuine immersion in a practice offered insights lost on more detached observers. Cross-disciplinary dialogue, combining anthropology, religious studies, and even cognitive science, continues to revisit Bernard's accounts of altered states, breath control, and the psychosomatic impact of yoga. What might Bernard himself think of his legacy? Given his stated humility about being a mere student of these vast traditions, he might be ambivalent about the pedestal on which some admirers place him. Nonetheless, he was a passionate communicator who believed that bridging East and West could facilitate mutual enrichment. He likely would have celebrated the wide acceptance yoga now enjoys, while cautioning against superficial commercialism and dilution of the core teachings. Ultimately, the enduring relevance of Bernard's works lies in their capacity to inspire earnest seekers to look beyond cultural biases and academic boundaries. They illustrate that true understanding requires direct engagement, physical, mental, and spiritual. His writings invite readers to wonder about their own inner frontiers, to consider the possibility that, indeed, a penthouse of the gods lies not just on a distant plateau, but within their very consciousness, waiting to be explored. Like many pioneer figures, Bernard's life and writings have not been without controversy. Critics have pointed out potential inaccuracies in his descriptions of Tibetan customs or rituals, arguing that his limited fluency in the language and relatively short stay in Lhasa could not yield the depth of understanding he claimed. Some scholars question whether he romanticized aspects of Tibetan life, playing into the Western fascination with the mystical East. Certain researchers also highlight the phenomenon of cultural appropriation, suggesting that Bernard, as an outsider, may have taken esoteric practices out of their cultural and lineage-based contexts. They contend that while his intention might have been genuine, the result could unintentionally distort or oversimplify complex traditions. In modern parlance, critics wonder if Bernard's presentation encouraged the commodification of spiritual practices for Western consumption. Additionally, skeptics have accused Bernard of inflating the extent of his training under Tibetan lamas. Rumors occasionally surface that he exaggerated his access to higher tantric empowerments, though the available evidence remains inconclusive. In interviews and passages from his writing, Bernard sometimes used language that implied deeper initiation, but he also frequently acknowledged his status as a novice. Where the line between faithful reportage and self-promotion lies remains a matter of debate. Counterpoints to these critiques often come from yoga practitioners, amateur scholars, and some Tibetan lamas who recall Bernard's genuine dedication. They argue that no single foreigner could fully master Tibetan Buddhism in such a brief window, and Bernard never truly claimed to have done so. Instead, they see Bernard's accounts as valuable preliminary sketches, an opening for more thorough study by later scholars fluent in Tibetan who could expand upon or correct any misunderstandings. Moreover, they emphasize that even if Bernard's depiction was partial or colored by his background, it nonetheless broke new ground in bridging cultural divides. Regarding charges of romanticization, Bernard himself might have conceded that his writing, especially in Penthouse of the Gods, aimed to convey wonder and respect for Tibetan culture. Whether this amounts to a naive idealization is a matter of perspective. Some readers appreciate the poetic exuberance of his style, arguing that it conveys the spirit of awe that the land inspired in him. Others prefer a more detached anthropological tone. On the issue of cultural appropriation, Bernard's defenders point out that he took pains to show reverence for the traditions he encountered, repeatedly stating that deeper teachings were reserved for those within the culture and lineage. They note that many modern yoga practitioners, Western and Asian alike, mix and adapt traditions, sometimes far less respectfully than Bernard did. The fluidity of global religious exchange, they say, is an ongoing reality that often defies clear-cut judgments. Ultimately, the controversies surrounding Bernard may never be resolved with absolute clarity. His story unfolds in the hazy zone between honest personal quest and the inevitable limitations of cross-cultural understanding. From an academic standpoint, his works are best read alongside other ethnographic and historical accounts, providing a more balanced picture of Tibetan society and yogic practice. From a spiritual perspective, his writings can still ignite curiosity and open doors, even if they are not the final word on Himalayan esotericism. Bernard's life itself, vanished as it did in the rugged mountain passes, reflects something of this tension. He remains a figure who draws both admiration and skepticism, veneration and critique. Yet, in the swirl of debate, one thing seems undeniable. Theos Bernard ventured into realms few Westerners of his time attempted, and his accounts, whatever their flaws, spurred further exploration and dialogue about yoga, Buddhism, and the potential for genuine understanding between East and West. In conversations with friends and colleagues, Bernard often spoke of a future in which Eastern spiritual practices were no longer perceived as exotic curiosities, but as integral parts of global discourse on human potential. He believed that yoga, in its many forms, could help people cultivate physical health, mental clarity, and spiritual awareness. As Western societies faced the rapid pace of modern life, he foresaw that meditation and breath-centered disciplines would offer a much-needed antidote to stress and fragmentation. Alongside his published works, Bernard drafted notes for projects he hoped to complete one day. One such project was a comparative study of Tibetan Buddhist Tantra and the Hindu Tantric traditions of Bengal. He envisioned a volume that would show how different cultures employed mantras, deity visualizations, and chakra-based symbolism, revealing both distinct paths and shared conceptual frameworks. He believed such a study might encourage dialogue among practitioners and scholars, bridging misunderstandings that kept these traditions siloed. Another plan included establishing a retreat center in the United States, modeled loosely on the ashrams he had encountered in India and the monasteries in Tibet. Bernard fantasized about a mountainside property where seekers could immerse in disciplined practice, guided by visiting teachers from various lineages. He dreamed of a place that combined Western educational rigor, libraries, lectures, scientific instruments for measuring yogic effects, with the sanctity of a monastic retreat. We could show the world, he mused, that science and spirituality are not enemies, but partners in a deeper quest for truth. Bernard also entertained the possibility of returning to academia in a more formal capacity. Although he had defended his doctoral thesis at Columbia, his life had taken him on a peripatetic route that prevented a conventional academic career. Still, he appreciated the importance of rigorous scholarship. "If we can teach yoga and Buddhism in universities," he wrote in a letter, "we'll raise a generation that views these teachings not as mystical oddities, but as part of our shared human heritage." Friends recall him speaking about the role of women in spiritual communities. Bernard had witnessed the relative inclusivity of certain Indian ashrams, where female devotees practiced alongside men, and wondered if Tibetan Buddhism could adopt more egalitarian models. Although he never penned a full treatise on the subject, his notes indicate a forward-thinking stance, suggesting that the empowerment of women practitioners was essential for the broader evolution of yoga and Buddhism in the modern world. Collectively, these visions represent Bernard's aspiration to see a more interconnected global society. He was not naive about the challenges. He recognized the depth of cultural, linguistic, and ideological barriers. Yet, in his most hopeful moments, he believed that yoga and Buddhism offered a universal language, a method of personal transformation that could transcend differences. When we breathe together, he would say, there is a shared humanity that no doctrine can deny. Tragically, Bernard did not live to see how these ideas might manifest. His disappearance effectively closed the book on future projects. Yet, in the decades since, many of his dreams have found echoes in reality. Universities around the world now offer courses on yoga philosophy, Tibetan Buddhism, and comparative religious studies. Retreat centers that blend Eastern spiritual practices with Western pedagogical methods dot the global landscape. Women have taken prominent roles as teachers and scholars in yoga and Buddhism, contributing to a more inclusive spiritual culture. Whether consciously or not, these developments fulfill aspects of the vision Bernard once sketched. While he could not oversee them, he helped plant seeds, some of which have blossomed in ways he might never have anticipated. His story underscores the truth that visionary ideas can outlive their originators, germinating through the work of countless others who carry the flame forward. Theos Bernard's life was a tapestry woven from threads of adventure, scholarship, spiritual hunger, and cultural exchange. Born in Los Angeles at a time when the East was still shrouded in mystery for most Americans, he charted a course that would take him across continents and altitudes, ultimately arriving at the threshold of some of the most guarded monasteries on Earth. In India, he immersed himself in the techniques of Hatha Yoga, testing their effects on his own body and mind, then documented them in what became a groundbreaking thesis. In Tibet, he drew back the curtain, if only slightly, on Tantric Buddhist practices, forging relationships with lamas who saw in him a rare fusion of Western inquiry and Eastern devotion. His writings, whether the academic Hatha Yoga, the report of a personal experience, or the more accessible penthouse of the gods and heaven lies within you, brought the Himalayan mystique into Western living rooms. People who might never have set foot in Asia found themselves captivated by his narratives of chanting monks, luminous mandalas, and breath control exercises that promised new frontiers of human potential. Bernard's insistence that yoga was not a mere curiosity, but a discipline worthy of serious study, paved the way for the more widespread acceptance of yoga and meditation in the West. Yet, like the high peaks he climbed, Bernard's achievements were accompanied by steep precipices. His disappearance in the Himalayas, while tragic, also became the stuff of legend, encapsulating the risks inherent in pushing beyond the familiar. In life, he wrestled with the impossibility of fully reconciling academic skepticism with spiritual certainty, Western culture with Eastern esotericism. In death, or possible exile, he left an open question that continues to fascinate. What does it mean to truly devote one's life to the search for enlightenment? The narratives surrounding Bernard's final journey vary, and the truth may never be fully known. But perhaps that ambiguity is itself reflective of the spiritual path he championed. Like a Zen koan, it invites contemplation rather than closure. For those who read his works or retrace his steps, the question remains: does one find spiritual truth by traveling farther outward, scaling the physical summits of Tibet, or by venturing inward, discovering the penthouse of the gods within the human heart? Today, Yoga practitioners unroll their mats in studios across the globe, breathing consciously and aligning their bodies, often unaware of the early figures who helped bridge the gap between East and West. Tibetan meditation techniques, once almost inaccessible outside monastic settings, are now taught in community centers and apps, integrated into therapies and wellness programs. Bernard's footprints, faint though they may be, can be discerned in the broad acceptance and adaptation of these practices. At the same time, modern critics remind us to approach cross-cultural exchanges with humility and respect. Appropriation and commercialization lurk as ever-present pitfalls. Bernard's story illustrates both the best and the most challenging aspects of such exchanges: the genuine aspiration to learn from another culture, and the inevitable misunderstandings that occur along the way. In the end, Theos Bernard remains an emblem of a universal yearning that transcends geography and epoch, the desire to reach the highest realms of human possibility. Whether those realms are literal mountaintops or metaphorical peaks of consciousness, they beckon each generation anew. Bernard's life suggests that such a pursuit requires courage, openness, intellectual rigor, and the willingness to walk paths few have tread. His works, part travelogue, part spiritual autobiography, beckon us to consider that the ultimate pilgrimage might be both an external journey across the world's roof and an internal climb toward the summit of one's own inner being. And so this narrative ends much as Bernard's life did, poised on the brink of uncharted territory, with the future uncertain and the final answers undisclosed. Yet the legacy he left endures in every earnest question asked by a novice yogi, every mind awakened by Tibetan chant, and every heart stirred by the possibility of a deeper, grander understanding of life. If Theos Bernard taught us anything, it is that the path to higher truths may be demanding and elusive, but for those called to it, there may be no other way to live. Note on sources and accuracy. This extended narrative biography draws upon Bernard's published works, Penthouse of the Gods, Heaven Lies Within You, and his Columbia thesis, Hatha Yoga, the report of a personal experience, as well as scholarly discussions about his life and travels. Where direct dialogue is included, it is reconstructed based on Bernard's own writings, letters, and accounts by contemporaries, aiming to capture the spirit and content of his interactions as accurately as possible. Some conversations and personal reflections have been stylized to provide a cohesive narrative while respecting the historical context.